Good day, and welcome to Painful Past. Today we cover every major war crime of the Second World War, not the sanitized textbook version, the real one. This war killed over 70 million people. A significant portion of those deaths were not combat, they were policy, deliberate, systematic. We begin with the most organized murder machine in human history. To understand the scale of Nazi war crimes, you first need to understand how the regime radicalized its own institutions. It did not happen in a single moment. Between 1933 and 1939, Jews and other targeted groups were stripped of citizenship, banned from professions, and subjected to state-sponsored violence. Each step normalized the next. By the time the war began, the infrastructure of persecution was already mature. The first mass killings were not in camps, they were in the open. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, 4 mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen followed directly behind the army. Their job was to shoot Jews, communist officials, and Roma on the spot. At Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kyiv, 33,771 Jews were shot over 2 days in September 1941. Babi Yar was not an isolated event. It was one of hundreds. The Einsatz groups operated across the entire Eastern Front, moving from village to village. By the end of 1941, they had killed an estimated 500,000 people. By the end of the war, the total attributed to these mobile units alone exceeded 1.5 million. All of this happened before the death camps reached full capacity. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942 formalized what the Nazis called the final solution. 15 senior officials sat in the villa outside Berlin and coordinated the logistics of murdering every Jew in Europe. They discussed it like a railroad schedule: transportation routes, processing capacity, labor allocation. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. The decision to murder millions took less time than a lunch break. The result was 6 dedicated extermination camps built in occupied Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. These were not concentration camps where people were imprisoned. They were facilities engineered for mass killing. Treblinka alone processed approximately 900,000 people between July 1942 and August 1943. It operated for just over a year. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest and most complex. It functioned simultaneously as a labor camp, a concentration camp, and an extermination center. New arrivals were subjected to selections on the platform. Those deemed fit for labor went one way, the rest went directly to the gas chambers. Over 1 million people, the vast majority of them Jews, were killed at Auschwitz alone. The gas chambers used a pesticide called Zyklon B, originally developed for delousing. Each chamber at Auschwitz could kill up to 2,000 people in a single operation. Jewish prisoners called Sonderkommando were forced under threat of death to remove bodies and operate the crematoria. Several of them buried written testimonies in the ground near the gas chambers. Archaeologists recovered them after the war. The men who built and ran this system had names and ranks and career ambitions. Heinrich Himmler ran the SS and oversaw all concentration and death camps. Reinhard Heydrich chaired the Wannsee Conference and designed the administrative framework of the final solution. Rudolf Haas was a commandant of Auschwitz for most of its operational life. None of them showed remorse. All of them had paperwork to prove what they did. Their ends varied. Heydrich was assassinated in Prague in May 1942 by Czech and Slovak paratroopers trained in Britain, one of the few successful targeted killings of a senior Nazi during the war. Himmler was captured by British forces in May 1945 and bit a cyanide capsule during interrogation. Hers was tried in Poland, returned to Auschwitz in chains, and hanged at the camp's main gate in April 1947. Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat responsible for coordinating the transportation of Jews to death camps, escaped to Argentina after the war using forged documents. He lived in Buenos Aires under the name Ricardo Clement for 15 years. In 1960, Mossad agents abducted him, smuggled him to Israel, and he was tried publicly in Jerusalem. Hannah Arendt covered the trial and coined the phrase, "the banality of evil." He was hanged in 1962. Now we move to the Pacific. Imperial Japan's war crimes receive far less attention in Western education, but in terms of scale and systematic brutality, they are fully comparable to the Nazi record. The Imperial Japanese Army operated under a military culture that treated surrender as the ultimate disgrace. That belief shaped how they treated not just enemy soldiers, but civilian populations across Asia. The results were catastrophic. The rape of Nanking began in December 1937, before the World War officially started. Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital of Nanking and over the following 6 weeks conducted mass executions, assaults, and looting on a scale that shocked even neutral observers. Foreign diplomats and businessmen remaining in the city established a safety zone and documented what they witnessed. Estimates of the death toll ranged from 200,000 to 300,000. What makes the documentation of Nanking particularly significant is who recorded it. Nazi Party member John Rabe, a German businessman who ran the safety zone, kept a detailed diary. His account is one of the primary historical records of the massacre. The fact that a member of the Nazi Party found the Japanese conduct in Nanking excessive enough to document and protest tells you something important about its nature. The Manila Massacre of February and March 1945 is less known but equally devastating. As American forces closed in on the Philippine capital, Japanese troops under General Tomoyuki Yamashita conducted a systematic killing campaign against Filipino civilians. Over 100,000 people were murdered in a single month, in hospitals, in churches, in their homes. It was one of the worst urban massacres of the entire war. Unit 731 operated out of a facility near Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria from 1937 onward under the command of General Shiro Ishii. Its stated purpose was biological and chemical warfare research. Its actual practice involved conducting live experiments on human prisoners, Chinese, Korean, Soviet, and Allied, without anesthesia. Experiments included deliberate infection with plague, cholera, and typhoid, frostbite studies, vivisection, and pressure chamber testing. At least 3,000 people died inside Unit 731's main facility. That number does not include the deaths caused by field deployment of biological weapons against Chinese civilian populations. Plague-infected fleas were dropped from aircraft over cities. Contaminated food and water supplies were introduced into villages. The true death toll from Unit 731's operations across China is estimated in the hundreds of thousands by some historians. The post-war fate of Unit 731's leadership is one of the most troubling outcomes of the entire war crimes accounting. General Ishii and the majority of his researchers were granted full immunity from prosecution by the United States government in exchange for their experimental data. The reasoning was Cold War strategic value. The men who conducted some of the worst medical crimes in history walked free. Ishii died of throat cancer in Tokyo in 1959. General Yamashita, held responsible for the Manila Massacre under the Command Responsibility Doctrine, was tried by a U.S. military tribunal and hanged in the Philippines in February 1946. His case established a legal precedent that commanders are responsible for the actions of their troops, even when they did not personally order specific atrocities. That principle, the Yamashita Standard, remains part of international military law today. We turn now to the treatment of prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention had established clear protections for captured soldiers. Most of the major powers had signed it. Compliance was another matter entirely and depended almost entirely on which theater of the war you were in and which army had captured you. In Western Europe, the rules were followed imperfectly but recognizably. In the Pacific and on the Eastern Front, they were largely ignored. The Bataan Death March of April 1942 is among the most documented atrocities committed against Allied prisoners. After the fall of the Philippines, approximately 75,000 Filipino and American soldiers were forced to march over 65 miles to a prison camp in brutal heat with almost no food or water. Guards beat, bayoneted, and beheaded prisoners who fell behind. Somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 men died on the march itself. Survival in Japanese prison camps was far from guaranteed even after the march. The overall death rate for Allied prisoners held by Japan was approximately 27%. In German camps on the Western Front, that figure was around 4%. The difference was deliberate policy. Japanese military doctrine held that soldiers who surrendered had forfeited their right to humane treatment. That belief was codified, not incidental. The Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union operated under entirely different rules, or more accurately, the near absence of rules. Neither country had ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention's prisoner of war provisions relative to each other. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, approximately 3.3 million died in captivity. That is a death rate of 57%. Soviet prisoners in German hands were deliberately starved. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, hundreds of thousands died in open-air enclosures without shelter, food, or medical care. German military leadership classified Soviet soldiers as racially and ideologically subhuman, a direct application of Nazi ideology to military policy. The systematic murder of Soviet POWs is one of the largest and least discussed atrocities of the entire war. German soldiers fared badly in Soviet captivity as well. Of the 91,000 Germans captured at the Battle of Stalingrad in February 1943, fewer than 6,000 survived to return to Germany. Most died from cold, starvation, and disease in Soviet labor camps called gulags. The Eastern Front was a war of annihilation in both directions, and prisoners on both sides paid the price with their lives. We now look at the civilian massacres that rarely appear in standard history courses, the reprisals. These were not battlefield events. They were deliberate punishments inflicted on civilian populations, often in response to resistance activity, and often based on false or exaggerated intelligence. They followed a consistent pattern: collective punishment, disproportionate force, and the deliberate targeting of people who had no part in the original incident. Oradour-sur-Glane, France, June 10, 1944, 4 days after D-Day. The SS Das Reichsdivision, frustrated by French resistance disruptions to their movement north, entered the village of Oradour-sur-Glane. They separated the population. The men were herded into barns and shot. The women and children, 642 people total, were locked inside the village church. The SS set it on fire. One woman escaped through a window. Everyone else died. The village was never rebuilt. Today, it stands exactly as it was left on June 10, 1944. Burnt-out cars, collapsed walls, rusted sewing machines. The French government preserved it as a permanent memorial and warning. Only one full SS trial for Oradour ever took place in 1953 in France, and many of the convicted received pardons within years. The survivors of Oradour protested the pardons publicly for decades. Lidice, Czechoslovakia, June 1942. Following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich by Allied trained paratroopers, Hitler ordered collective punishment against Czech civilians. The village of Lidice was selected, apparently based on a tenuous and incorrect connection to the assassination. On June 10, 1942, all 173 men and boys over 15 were shot. The women were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. 88 of them died there. The children of Lidice, 92 of them, were taken separately. A small number who were deemed racially suitable for Germanization were sent to German families to be raised under new names. The rest were transported to the Chelno extermination camp and gassed. The village itself was burned, bulldozed, and the river was rerouted so that no physical trace remained. The Nazis then filmed the destruction and screened it as propaganda. The Malmedy massacre occurred on December 17, 1944, during the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge. SS troops from the 1st SS Panzer Division under Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper captured approximately 150 American soldiers near the Belgian town of Malmedy. The prisoners were assembled in a field. German soldiers opened fire on them. 84 Americans were killed. Some were shot while trying to flee. Others were shot where they stood. Piper was convicted at the Dachau Malmedy trial in 1946 and sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to life, then reduced further, and he was released in 1956. He moved to France under his real name and lived quietly until July 1976, when his house was attacked and burned. He was found dead inside. No one was ever charged. Most historians believe French resistance veterans or former concentration camp survivors carried out the attack. There were massacres on the Allied side as well. History requires honesty on this point. The Dachau massacre of April 1945 involved American soldiers shooting captured SS guards at the liberated Dachau concentration camp. Estimates range from 17 to over 50 killed. The soldiers had just walked through a camp containing thousands of dead and dying prisoners. Military investigations were opened, then quietly closed. No one was prosecuted. The Soviet NKVD massacre at Katyn Forest in 1940 predates the German invasion of the Soviet Union, but belongs in any honest accounting of this era. Soviet secret police executed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intellectuals in the forests near Smolensk. The Soviet Union blamed Germany for decades. The truth was not officially acknowledged by Russia until 1990. The cover-up lasted 50 years. By 1945, the Allied powers had accumulated enough documentation, captured orders, administrative records, testimony from survivors, and physical evidence from liberated camps to construct something that had never existed before, a formal international criminal tribunal. The decision to try the Nazi leadership rather than execute them summarily was itself controversial. Winston Churchill had initially favored summary execution. The Americans pushed for trials. The Nuremberg trials opened on November 20, 1945, in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, the same city where the Nazi racial laws had been announced a decade earlier. 24 major defendants stood trial before judges from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The charges included crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, a category that had to be legally defined from scratch for this tribunal. 12 defendants received death sentences. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful Nazi after Hitler, was sentenced to hang. The night before his scheduled execution, he bit a cyanide capsule that had been smuggled into his cell, the source of which was never conclusively determined. He died on October 15, 1946. 10 others were hanged the following day. Rudolf Hess received a life sentence and died in Spandau prison in 1987 at age 93. The Tokyo trials, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, ran from May 1946 to November 1948. 28 Japanese military and political leaders were indicted. 7 were sentenced to death and hanged, including former Prime Minister and Army General Hideki Tojo. The trials were criticized by some historians for focusing blame on a narrow group, while Emperor Hirohito, who had sanctioned the war, was granted immunity for strategic post-war reasons. The most glaring gap in post-war justice was Unit 731. While Japanese generals were hanged for command responsibility over civilian massacres, the men who personally conducted biological experiments on living human beings were given full immunity by the United States. General Ishii's data on human biological responses to plague, frostbite, and disease was considered too valuable to prosecute. The victims of those experiments received no acknowledgement and no justice. Not all war criminals were captured. A significant number of senior Nazis escaped Europe through organized escape networks historians call rat lines. These routes ran through sympathetic Catholic institutions, international Red Cross documentation loopholes, and neutral countries. An estimated 700 to 1,000 former Nazis reached South America, primarily Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Bolivia, using false identities and forged travel documents. Joseph Mengele, the SS physician at Auschwitz who conducted experiments on twins, dwarfs, and children, selecting victims directly from the arrival platform, escaped to South America in 1949. He lived in Argentina, then Paraguay, then Brazil. West Germany issued a warrant for his arrest in 1959. Mossad tracked him but never captured him. He suffered a stroke while swimming at a beach in Brazil in 1979 and drowned. He was never tried for anything. Klaus Barbie was the Gestapo chief in Lyon, France, responsible for the torture and deportation of thousands of Jews and resistance members, including the torture and murder of resistance leader Jean Moulin. After the war, U.S. Army intelligence hired Barbie as an informant because of his knowledge of communist networks in Europe. When his identity became a liability, American handlers helped him escape to Bolivia in 1951 under the name Klaus Altman. Barbie was identified in Bolivia by Nazi hunters Beata and Serge Klarsfeld in 1971. Bolivia refused to extradite him for over a decade. He was finally expelled in 1983 and returned to France, where he was tried for crimes against humanity. The trial lasted 2 months. He was convicted in July 1987 and sentenced to life in prison. He died of leukemia in Lyon in September 1991, the city where he had tortured prisoners in the basement of the Hotel Terminus. The legal frameworks built from these trials changed international law permanently. The Nuremberg Principles established that following orders is not a valid defense for crimes against humanity. The 1948 Genocide Convention defined genocide as a crime under international law for the first time. The 1949 Geneva Conventions were comprehensively revised and expanded. These documents exist because of what happened between 1939 and 1945, and because of the trials that followed. The International Criminal Court, established in 2002, is the direct institutional descendant of Nuremberg and Tokyo. It has jurisdiction over genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Every tribunal convened since 1945 for the former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, for Sierra Leone, has operated on the legal foundation laid at Nuremberg. History built something from the wreckage, not enough and not fast enough, but something durable. There is one final point worth making before we close. The war crimes of the Second World War were not committed by a separate category of human being. The Einsatzgruppen were recruited from ordinary men, teachers, lawyers, police officers. The Unit 731 researchers were trained physicians and scientists. The SS guards at Auschwitz went home on leave and played with their children. The capacity for this kind of systematic cruelty does not require monsters. It requires permission. That is the lesson that makes this history genuinely uncomfortable. It is easy to study the Second World War as a story about evil people who were eventually defeated by good ones. It is harder and more important to study it as a story about what institutions, ideologies, and dehumanizing language can produce when ordinary people stop asking questions and start following orders. The Nuremberg Principles exist precisely because that distinction needed to be written into law.